Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Ask Dr. Nick. My name is Dr. Nick Schmidlkoffer, and I work for the Neurologic Wellness Institute here in downtown Chicago. And today's question of the day is, how does early adversity relate to childhood and adolescent anxiety? And this is an important question because there are a lot of problems with children nowadays with increasing rates of autism, ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and anxiety. And all of these, or each one of these former problems, former disorders, are also have anxiety as a comorbidity. And so it's important to identify possible causes that could be leading to this anxiety and these disorders of autism, ADHD. And so today we're mostly going to talk about anxiety, but I do want to just kind of put that in your head that what we're talking about could also be related to other childhood or adolescent disorders. And so I want to get right into this new article from 2020. It is a paper out of the developmental and psychopathology. And here it is. So 2020, Development and Psychopathology. It's called Mind and Gut, the associations between mood and gastrointestinal distress in children exposed to adversity. So right away in the beginning, I just want to mention we're going to be talking about the gut-brain axis, or the brain-gut axis, and how that relates, or how that can influence anxiety and anxiety-related conditions. And so we'll talk about the abstract, and we'll go through a couple different figures to show the severity of this and the implications. So in the abstract, we have gastrointestinal and mental disorders are highly comorbid. We know that. Interactions between brain and bacteria, so the microbiome that live within the gastrointestinal system, underlie the adversity gastrointestinal anxiety interactions. Basically, it's saying that the microbiome is one of the key players in what causes early adversity to then this disruption in the gut microbiome to these anxiety. These links have not been investigated though in human development, even though they have been in animal models. So they used 344 youth adolescents who were between 3 and 18 years old. They were raised either with their biological parents or were exposed to early adverse caregiving experiences. This could be either institutional or foster care, or an international adoption, something that that changed their life early in their life. And they're looking at this adversity gastrointestinal anxiety associations. So they did 2 different studies. In study 1, they looked at previous adverse care experiences, and they said they were associated with an increased incidence of gastrointestinal symptoms in the youth. These symptoms were also associated with concurrent and future anxiety. And they measured it across 5 years, which is a pretty long study. And those symptoms mediated the adversity anxiety association from the initial time 1, they call it. The subsample of children also provided stool samples, which was nice to look at. And they were able to look then at the gut microbiome. And so that adversity was associated with changes in both the alpha and beta diversity of the microbiome. We'll talk about that. And bacteria levels. So the adversity associated and adversity independent. And they were correlated with prefrontal cortex activation to emotional faces. So basically, children were given faces, whether they were positive or negative, and the child had to basically say what their reaction was to them, or they would study their reaction to them, depending on their age. And so let's go right away into this picture here. And so we have anxiety here on the left and gastrointestinal distress on the right. You can see there's a positive correlation with if you have less gastrointestinal distress, you have less anxiety. If you have more gastrointestinal distress, they have more anxiety. Digestive issues were classified specifically as not like distress, like cramping or pain or bloating, but digestive issues were more problems with like appetite and constipation, diarrhea, those kind of things. So, and then here we have, based on those scatter plots and all the patients, all the kids that they looked at, caregiving history were positively associated with an increased gastrointestinal distress. Caregiving history of, again, early adverse effects were, again, positively associated with increased anxiety in children. And so basically there is this path, and increased gastrointestinal distress were also associated with increased anxiety. So there's this path from caregiving history of early adversity that leads to gastrointestinal distress, and therefore gastrointestinal distress is what then causes the anxiety many of the times. Now, yes, there can be a direct effect from this one to this one, caregiving history or early adversity to anxiety, but GI distress is a big player, therefore the gut microbiome is probably a big player. And we'll get into that next. So this is a really cool graph. So on the left, they have red as high gastrointestinal distress. Black is the low gastrointestinal distress. And you have anxiety scores at 3 different time periods. With the first time they took it, then 2 years later, which was time 2, and then 2 years after that, which was time 3. So across a 4 to 5 year span, and they saw that anxiety levels were higher in the high GI distress patients, high GI distress children. Although anxiety decreased over time for all children, it stayed higher for those with high GI distress. Therefore, high GI distress not only caused increased anxiety at the time period, but even later, 4 or 5 years later, after maybe that GI distress was down or was decreased, there was still higher anxiety. Now, when we broke that up, or they broke that up into high GI distress and low GI distress with either the comparison group is the dark or solid lines, and then the early adversity or EA group is the dotted lines. And they showed that the early adversity group, no matter what, had higher anxiety than the comparison group. Yet the ones that had higher, or the ones that had early adversity with the high GI distress had the highest. This is a pretty clear association that early adversity can lead to anxiety, but of course, that mostly goes through that gastrointestinal issue. So basically, you can have early adversity with a pretty good GI system, and you won't, or a child won't have as much anxiety, which is just a good thing to take a look at and to understand. So then when they looked at the alpha diversity and the beta diversity in the stool, so alpha diversity is basically like within subjects, so within one person, how much diversity is there? And there's 2 ways you can look at this. Observed richness, which is basically that here a high alpha diversity is that there's multiple groups, multiple species present, versus a low, there's only 2 species versus 4, okay? The Shannon's diversity is going to be, a high is going to be a rich, so multiple amounts of bacterial groups. They're also evenly distributed, versus a low is going to be, you might have multiple amounts, like 3 here, but it's heavily dominated by 1. Therefore, that's not equal, and therefore has less diversity. And so we want this one, we want high diversity with multiple kinds, multiple types. Beta diversity is looking more between subjects. So basically one person can have completely different diversity than another. But then we're looking at a phylogenetic tree, and do they separate out, and do they have diversity among people, also people that they were relatives to, right? So we want to have about the same, or we want to have diversity among the 2 different people. So let's say your parents have a certain amount, and other parent has another one. We want to have a combination of both, okay? And that's looking at beta diversity. So they did the tests of the amount of bacteria, and the comparison group had much lower, so the comparison group had much higher percent of bacteria of this lactospirae group, okay, and a much higher amount of the percent bacteria from the Clostridiales, okay. But early adversity did not. They had much lower, much lower. If you look here too at like relative abundance, you can see the early adversity group had much less or much fewer bacterial species, okay? While, and again, the diversity was kind of more like that Shannon's diversity where they had too much of two groups, but if you look at the comparison group, they were more evenly spread out. So then we take that into how that affects the brain. And so we know the microbiome affects the brain and the gut are highly correlated. And so they were looking at a functional MRI, so basically how these different brain areas are going to spike or have activity when looking at fear-based pictures, okay? And so they looked at the prefrontal cortex. They looked at, it was more of the prefrontal cortex, the medial prefrontal, the lateral prefrontal, more medial prefrontal, the precuneus, and then some other areas in the cingulate gyrus and the posterior cingulate, okay? And so they looked at a lot of different areas. All these are related to kind of anxiety-related structures. And the comparison group here, if they had more percentage of lactospirae, and therefore they had a different association in activity in these brain areas, okay, a positive association. The ones with early adversity who had less lactospirae, so you can see the percentages here, 2.4 was high, but then much of them were very, very low. Because they had less lactospirae, they had more of a negative correlation in this fMRI. They had more blue in many areas and less red, so a negative correlation of activity in these prefrontal regions. The reason why this is important is your prefrontal cortex is kind of what helps you decide and make decisions and be able to understand that fear may be present, but we can handle it, and therefore it can decrease anxiety. And so it's important that kids have the ability to control their prefrontal cortex. And it looks like how they correlated this to one specific bacteria or bacterial species. So in conclusion, this was just kind of a complex one, but in conclusion, basically, the mind and gut are highly related, especially in children. And we can look at children, we can look at what causes childhood anxiety. And it's generally related to gut and the gut microbiome and problems with development there, because a lack of control in healthy bacteria can lead to inflammation and lack of healthy brain development. And if we add early childhood adversity to that, then that just compounds the anxiety that we see in these children. So I hope you guys enjoyed this one. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them below. I would love to hear them. I would love to hear any suggestions for future topics as well. Thanks again, and have a great day. Stay healthy.